Her last coin spent and her last door closed in her face, a Lakota chief opened his own. The coin was a Morgan dollar, worn so smooth the eagle on the back had gone nearly flat. I found it on the ground outside the trading post in Caldwell 3 days after I buried my youngest brother, and I kept it in my vest pocket for 11 years because I didn't know what else to do with luck I hadn't earned. I'm telling you about that coin because of what it meant at the end. Bear with me. I'll get there. My name is Standing Elk. I was chief of the Brule band camped on the Niobrara that winter, not hereditary chief, not a war chief anymore, just the man the elders had decided could talk to the agents without letting his temper ruin everything. I was 51 years old. I had gray in my braids and a right knee that complained every morning before the rest of me was awake. I had outlived my wife by 6 years, my brother by 3. I had 17 families under me and a government agent named Briggs who lied to our faces with a smile that never moved. That is who I was. I want you to understand what the Niobrara looked like that November. The river was low and dark, ice starting at the edges. The cottonwoods had gone bare, every leaf down, the branches just black lines against a white sky. The wind came out of the northwest and it didn't quit. It found every gap in every hide and every seam of every coat and it pushed in there and stayed. We had 3 lodges with smoke hole problems, 1 horse with a cracked hoof, and enough dried meat to last maybe 6 more weeks if we were careful. Briggs had shorted our annuity rations again and filed the paperwork saying he hadn't. I mention all of this so you understand I had plenty to think about already. It was the 3rd week of November when 2 hawks came and found me at the river where I was checking a fish trap and said there was a white woman at the edge of camp. He said it the way you say it when you're not sure if you're bringing news or a problem. I pulled the trap, found it empty and went to see. She was standing just past the last lodge, not quite in camp, not quite out of it either. Like she'd stopped herself before going further, deciding whether she had the right. She was wearing a dress that had been dark blue once, now faded to the color of a bruise. A wool shawl that wasn't heavy enough for the weather. Boots with the left sole separating from the upper. I could see the gap even from 20 feet. She was carrying a canvas bag that hung flat against her side, meaning there wasn't much in it. She was maybe 30 years old, though cold and hard use can add years. Brown hair coming out of its pins. Eyes that were the gray-green of river ice, and they were tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. She didn't flinch when I walked up. I gave her that. She said her name was Clara Marsh. She said she had come from Reedsville, a town about 14 miles east, and that she had been asked to leave. That is exactly how she said it, asked to leave. She said she had tried 3 farmsteads between there and here, and none of them had taken her in. She said she had 12 cents to her name and no food since yesterday morning, and she was sorry to bother me, but she didn't know what else to do. I looked at her for a moment. She looked back. I said, "Who asked you to leave Reedsville?" She said, "The town council." I said, "What did you do?" She said, "I didn't do anything. My husband did. He ran off with the hotel owner's wife and took the money from both our accounts." She paused. "The hotel owner is on the town council." I thought about that. I said, "Come inside." She followed me to my lodge. I didn't offer an explanation and she didn't ask for one. I gave her a bowl of broth. We had broth. We were past the point of wasting meat on broth. And she held the bowl in both hands for a long time before she drank it, just letting the heat into her palms. I watched her do that and I thought about cold hands, about what it means to be so used up by cold that even small warmth takes a moment to believe. That was the beginning. Now I need to tell you about Reedsville, because it matters. Reedsville was a town of about 300 people built on the premise that it was going to become something more than it was. It had a main street with a hotel, a land office, a dry goods, a church, a saloon that called itself a supper club, and a weekly newspaper that printed whatever Harlan Goss told it to print. Harlan Goss owned the hotel, the land office, and a good piece of the dry goods. He was also the man whose wife had run off with Clara's husband. The way I heard it later, Two Hawks found these things out. He had a gift for gathering talk. Harlan Goss had been furious in the particular way of men who have been made to look foolish. He couldn't chase down a man who was already gone. He couldn't admit publicly that his wife had chosen to leave. What he could do was make sure the woman left behind had no way to stay, no way to earn, no foothold of any kind. So her credit at the dry goods went away. The room she'd been renting from a widow named Paulson went away when Paulson's son, who owed Goss money, told her it needed to. The one offer of work she'd had, sewing for the dressmaker, went away when the dressmaker was told that women who associated with the Marsh woman would find their own business uncomfortable. 12 cents. That's what was left of Clara Marsh's life in Reedsville after Harlan Goss got done with it. She sat in my lodge that first night and I watched her eat a second bowl of broth, slower than the first, and I thought about what kind of man lets that happen to a woman because his pride is hurt. I thought about it the way you think about something that's been done badly, the way I thought about a fence post set wrong. It needs to come out and go back in right, and the longer you leave it wrong, the harder the fix. I didn't know yet that I was going to be the fix. What I knew was that she needed to stay the night, and probably more than one night, and I said so. She didn't argue. She said thank you in a way that sounded like she hadn't said it for a while and had to remember how. I moved my bedroll to the back corner and gave her the sleeping robes near the fire, and I lay there that night listening to the wind push at the lodge skins and thinking about 14 miles and 3 farmsteads and doors that don't open. The next morning she asked if she could be useful. That surprised me a little. Not that she asked it that way. Not could she help, could she do something, but could she be useful? Like she understood that being taken in put her in debt and she wasn't comfortable with that. I told her Two Hawks' wife had a bad knee and couldn't haul water easily from the river. She said she'd haul water. She did. She hauled water all morning, 3 trips, carrying 2 buckets each time, and she did it without making it into something. She just did it. Two Hawks' wife watched her the first trip with the look women give when they're deciding something. By the 3rd trip she wasn't watching anymore. That told me what I needed to know. It snowed that afternoon. Not hard, just enough to change the color of everything. Clara was helping my sister Brightwater patch a smoke hole problem. Brightwater had decided this was acceptable for reasons she didn't explain to me. And I watched the two of them up there for a while, Clara's blue dress against the gray sky, her hands quick and steady on the hide lashing. I thought she's got good hands. I didn't mean it any other way at the time. I just noticed. By the end of the first week, she had moved from sleeping in my lodge to taking meals with Brightwater's family, and there was a kind of order to her days. She sewed, hauled water, helped with the younger children when their mothers were busy. She learned 6 or 7 words in Lakota and used them carefully in the right places, which made the older women laugh but not in an unkind way. She didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. She didn't carry herself as though our customs were something to be patient about until she could get back to her own. I watched all of this from a careful distance, the way I watch most things. On the 9th day, Briggs came. Briggs was a government man, Indian agent, the kind who came once a month with the ration numbers already written before he saw anything. He rode into camp on a gray horse, and he had a man with him I didn't know, young and sharp-eyed, writing in a notebook. Briggs got down and shook my hand the way he always did, like he was doing me a favor. He said he'd heard we had a white woman in camp. I said yes. He said that was an unusual situation. I said it was. He said he imagined she'd be moving on soon. I said I imagined she'd move on when she had somewhere to go. He looked at me with that particular expression, not angry, just reminding me of something he thought I'd forgotten. He said there were people in Reedsville who were concerned about her. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, the people in Reedsville took her money, took her room, and took her work. Then they put her on the road in November with 12 cents and a broken boot. I don't think they're concerned about her. Briggs looked at the young man with the notebook. I said, you can write that down if you want. Briggs said he was just passing along what he'd been told. He said he hoped there wouldn't be any complications. He said it the way you say something when what you mean is that complications would be my fault. I said I didn't anticipate any. He left without going through the ration numbers that month, which meant the ration numbers were something he preferred not to have me look at closely. I filed that away. After he left, I stood for a while in the cold outside my lodge. The river was making the sound it makes in early freeze, a low creaking. I thought about the word complications. I thought about what kind of complication Clara Marsh was supposed to be, and what kind of complication she actually was, which was none. That evening she came and sat outside with me. Not next to me, close enough to talk, far enough to be proper. She asked what the agent had wanted. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is this going to cause trouble for you?" I said, "Let me worry about what causes me trouble." She looked at the river. She said, "I don't want to be a burden on people who already have enough to carry." I said, "You're not a burden." She said, "You don't know yet if that's true." I said, "I know more than you think." She looked at me then, not long, just a moment. Then she looked back at the river. I didn't say anything else. Neither did she. We sat there until the cold made it unreasonable to stay. December came down hard. There is a kind of cold on the Niobrara that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives one morning and the temperature has dropped 20 degrees, and the river ice that was just a shelf on the edges has gone all the way across. And you understand that this is the thing now. This is winter, and it will be a while before anything else. We settled into it. We had done it before. There is a rhythm to hard winter in a camp, the fires that need constant feeding, the horses that need checking, the meat that needs monitoring in the cold cache so it doesn't freeze solid and can't be cut. There is not a lot of ease, but there is order, and order is its own kind of comfort. Clara fit into the order. She was not somebody who needed to be told what to do once she understood what needed doing. I watched her figure out the shape of each day and step into it. She was not cheerful about it in a performed way. She was just present. I started talking to her in the evenings, not about anything that mattered at first, about the weather, about the horses, about what I knew of the country south and west. She had a way of listening that made you say more than you planned. Not because she pushed, she didn't push. She just gave you her whole attention and you felt it, and it made you want to fill it with something true. One evening I told her about my wife, Walks Far. She had been dead 6 years. I hadn't talked about her much since the first year, not to anyone. I told Clara that Walks Far had been the one who understood the politics of the camp in ways I didn't always see, who was close to whose loyalties were shifting, which old woman's opinion mattered most on a given question. I told her I'd relied on that. I told her I still missed it, not in a grief way anymore, just in the way you miss a tool that was exactly right for a job. Clara was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then she said, "That doesn't sound like how most men talk about what they miss." I said, "What do most men say?" She said that they miss having someone to take care of, someone who needed them. I thought about that. I said, Walks Far didn't need me to take care of her. She was capable of that herself. What she needed was somebody who understood what she was doing and valued it. Clara said, "Yes, just that." I looked at her. She was looking at the fire. I didn't know what to do with that yet, so I let it pass. There was a man in camp named Red Shirt who had an opinion about Clara. He wasn't loud about it. Red Shirt was never loud, but he had a way of asking questions that were really statements. He asked me one morning why I was keeping a white woman from Reedsville, and whether that was going to bring trouble to camp before spring. I said I kept her because she needed keeping, and I had the means. He said the town might come. I said the town was welcome to come. He looked at me for a moment. He wasn't challenging me. Red Shirt was not that kind of man. He was just making sure I'd thought it through. I had thought it through. There was a thing I understood about men like Harlan Goss that Red Shirt maybe didn't. Men like that want you afraid. When you are afraid, they have all the leverage. But Goss had no leverage over me. He couldn't take my credit or my room or my work. What he could take, my people's rations, my people's land, he was already taking, through Briggs, and that had nothing to do with Clara. My situation with Goss was the same with or without her. So I was not going to send a woman into the cold. In order to not be afraid of a man I was already not afraid of. I told Red Shirt some of this. Not all of it. He chewed on what I told him, and then he nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing. A week later he helped Clara carry timber for a windbreak on the north side of his own lodge. I saw it from across the camp and thought, all right, we're past that. The thing happened in January. 2 of Goss's men came into camp on a morning when the temperature was below 0, and the snow was hard and dry on the ground. They were not threatening, exactly. They were the kind of threatening that tries to look like something else. They asked for me by name, which told me Briggs had given them information he shouldn't have, and they said that a woman named Clara Marsh was believed to be residing with us, and that her presence was requested back in Reedsville. I said she wasn't a prisoner here and could speak for herself. They looked at her. She was standing maybe 10 feet behind me. She had come out of Bright Waters Lodge when she heard voices. The taller one said, "Mr. Goss would like to speak with you, ma'am. Says there may be a misunderstanding that wants clearing up." Clara said, "There's no misunderstanding." The taller one smiled. He said, "Mr. Goss feels like maybe you were treated unkindly and he'd like to make it right. There's a room waiting for you at the hotel. Nice, warm room." Clara was quiet for a moment. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the 2 men. Then Clara said, "Mr. Goss took away everything I had in that town because his pride was wounded and he needed somewhere to put his anger. You can tell him the misunderstanding is his." The taller one's smile didn't go away exactly. It just changed into something harder. He looked at me. He said, "Chief, you'd be well advised to encourage her to come along." I said, "You've delivered your message. Now you can go." He looked at me for a moment with an expression that wanted to be a threat and found it had nowhere to land. Then he and the other one got back on their horses and went. After they were gone, nobody said anything for a bit. Then Red Shirt, who had been watching from over near the horse pen, said something in Lakota that made 2 of the younger men laugh. I turned around to look at Clara. She was standing straight, arms at her sides, but her jaw had a set to it that I recognized, the set of someone who's holding something together through will and not much else. I walked over to her. I didn't touch her. I just stood close enough so she knew I was there. She said quietly, "What if he sends more people?" I said, "He might. It won't change anything." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was level. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because it's right." She said, "That's not enough of a reason for most people to take on this kind of trouble." I said, "I didn't say I was most people." She looked at me for another moment. Then she did something I didn't expect. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, just a quick press, a second, no more, and then she let go and went back inside. I stood there in the cold for a while. That is the moment I remember most clearly. Not anything that came after, not anything that came before, just that. The weight of her hand on my arm for 1 second in the cold, and the feeling of something settling, the way a weight settles into the right place and goes quiet. Goss sent more men in February. Not 2 this time. 6, and a man I took to be a lawyer by the way he was dressed and the papers he was carrying. They said Clara Marsh had property in Reedsville, a sewing machine and some household goods still in the room at Widow Paulson's, and that they were legally authorized to take those items and apply them to an outstanding debt. I asked what debt. The lawyer said that her husband had borrowed money from Reedsville Mercantile, which Goss owned, and that since the husband was gone, the debt fell to the wife's assets. I said I wasn't familiar with that being the law. He said he was a lawyer and that it was. I said I'd take his word for it, and that Clara's sewing machine was in Nebraska and could be retrieved from Nebraska by anyone with a legal claim to it. He said she was also in Nebraska. I said I noticed that. He said she would need to come to Reedsville to address the matter legally. I said she'd address it when she had counsel of her own and not before. The lawyer looked at me with the particular frustration of a man who has prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself in another. He had no authority over me. He knew it and I knew it, and we both stood there in the cold knowing it together. He said, finally, that Mr. Goss found the situation highly irregular. I said I was sure he did. They left. That night I sent 2 hawks to Niobrara City to find out what was actually the law about a wife's liability for a husband's debts, and 2 hawks came back 4 days later saying he'd found a lawyer there who said the Reedsville lawyer had the law wrong, that a wife's separate property wasn't liable for a husband's personal debts, and that if they tried to actually file a suit it would fail, and they likely knew it. So it was theater. It had been theater the whole time. Goss sending men out into the cold to perform authority he didn't have, hoping Clara didn't know he didn't have it, hoping I didn't know, hoping one of us would fold. I told Clara what 2 hawks had found. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "So he's just going to keep sending people?" I said, "Maybe. Or he'll stop when he decides it's not worth his pride anymore." She said, "How long does that take with a man like that?" I said, "Depends on whether anything else embarrasses him in the meantime." She looked at me. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking that a letter to the territorial newspaper about irregular ration accounting by a certain Indian agent might create some other problems for certain people in Reedsville." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been holding that." I said, "I've been holding it." She said, "Why haven't you used it before?" I said, "Because it costs something to use. I only wanted to spend it when it was worth spending." She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I became aware of being looked at. There was something in her face I didn't try to name. She said, "You think like a man who's been in charge of people for a long time." I said, "I have been." She said, "I can tell," and then, quieter, "I can tell a lot of things about you." I didn't say anything to that, but I thought about it for a long time after. March came and the river started breaking up, the ice groaning and shifting, and with the first real thaw came the sense that the winter had been survived, and that what came next was something new. That feeling comes every spring, and you'd think after 50 years of springs you'd stop feeling it, but you don't. 2 hawks delivered the letter to the territorial paper, signed with my name, Chief Standing Elk, Brule Band, Niobrara. It detailed Briggs's consistent shortfalls in ration delivery and the discrepancy between his filed reports and the actual amounts received. I had kept records. I had been keeping records for 3 years in a ledger book that a missionary had left behind, because I understood that paper was how the white world kept its word and broke its word both, and I wanted to be able to tell the difference. The paper ran the letter in the 2nd week of March. By the end of that week, Briggs had received a letter of inquiry from the bureau office in Washington. 2 hawks heard this from the storekeeper in Niobrara City, who had heard it from the mail rider. Goss sent no more men after that. I don't know exactly why. Maybe the letter created enough visibility around me that he decided the calculation had changed. Maybe someone told him the debt claim wouldn't hold up in court. Maybe he just got tired. Men like that run on anger and angle both, and when the angle closes off, sometimes the anger just has nowhere useful to go. What I know is that after March, nobody came from Reedsville anymore. Spring was slow that year, the way it sometimes is on the Niobrara, the warmth arriving in pieces, a warm week and then a cold snap and then warm again. The prairie grass came up green and then got frosted back and then came up again, more stubborn each time. Clara stayed through the spring. I want to be careful here because I'm an old man telling a true thing and I don't want to make it into something it wasn't. It wasn't fast. It wasn't like the stories. There was no moment where we both said the same thing at the same time or the light caught her just right and I understood something. It was slower than that and quieter. What it was this. One morning in April I woke up and it was her I thought of first. Not the horses, not the weather, not the ration question or the letter or anything with weight to it. Just her. The way she moved in the morning, quick and purposeful. The way she listened. The way she had pressed her hand on my arm in January and then walked away like she hadn't done something that mattered. I lay there a while with that. Then I got up and went about my day. She was at the river that morning filling buckets. She looked up when she heard me on the bank. She said early. I said always. She went back to filling the bucket. I stood there like I had a reason to be there, which I didn't, not a practical one. She said without looking up, "Are you going to say something or just stand there looking at the river?" I said I was deciding. She stood up straight with the full bucket, looked at me. The morning light was flat and gray, and it made her face very clear, no softness in it, just her. She said, "What were you deciding?" I said, "Whether to tell you something that might complicate things." She set the bucket down. She said, "I think you should tell me." I said, "I think I'd like you to stay. Not because there's nowhere else for you, because I'd like you to stay." She looked at me for a long moment. The river was making its spring noise, loud and moving. Then she said, "I was wondering when you'd say that." I said, "How long have you been wondering?" She said, "Since January." And then, "Since you stood in the cold and told those men no." I said, "That was just right." She said, "I know, that's why." I want to say it happened right then, something clean and clear. But what actually happened was she picked up her water bucket and I picked up the other one and we walked back to camp together and that was it. That was the whole thing. And it was enough. We were married in June. Bright Water organized most of it, which meant it was done properly and in the right order and with the right people present. Red Shirt gave a long speech that was mostly about me, but included 3 pieces of advice for Clara about what to expect living with a man who said less than he thought. The older women found this very funny. Clara smiled in a way that told me she found it accurate. I want to tell you about one more thing. The Morgan dollar, the one I'd been carrying for 11 years in my vest pocket. 3 days after we were married, I was sitting outside in the evening and I had it in my hand, turning it over the way I sometimes did. Clara came and sat beside me now, not the careful distance of before, and she saw it. She said, "What's that?" I told her where I'd found it. Outside the trading post in Caldwell, 3 days after I buried my youngest brother. That I'd kept it because I didn't know what to do with luck I hadn't earned. She looked at it in my palm. She said, "And now?" I said, "I think I know what to do with it now." I put it in her hand. She looked at it, then looked at me. She didn't say anything right away. She just closed her hand around it, and there was a long moment where we just sat there in the evening with the sound of the camp around us, the horses, the fire, the children somewhere doing something that made someone laugh. She said finally, "You think this is luck you earned?" I said, "I think it's luck I understand now." She leaned against me, just a little, her shoulder against mine. She was warm and she was solid and she was there, and I put my arm around her and she let me, and we sat that way until it was too dark to see the coin in her hand. That was 20 years ago. I'm an old man now, old enough that the knee that was bad at 51 is a comedy at 71. Clara's hair has gone to gray at the temples, and she cuts it short in summer and lets it grow in winter, and I like it both ways. She still hauls water, though I've told her not to, and she still doesn't listen to me about it, and I have stopped pretending I didn't know that was going to be how it was. We have a life. We have children, 2 of them, one who has his mother's eyes and one who has my ears, and neither of whom is going to thank me for mentioning either. We have a camp that is smaller than it was because of the usual pressures, and a fire that is warm, and a government that is still getting things wrong in the specific ways I predicted 20 years ago. Briggs was replaced by another man who is about 70% better, which is better than I expected. The territorial newspaper ran 2 more of my letters over the years, which helped on specific things and didn't help on others. Harlan Goss's hotel burned down in 1889. Nobody was hurt. I feel no particular way about this. What I feel a particular way about is this. I was 51 years old and I had done what I could do and buried what I'd lost, and I was managing. Managing is not the same as living, but it gets you through the winters, and I thought that was what I had left. And then a woman came to the edge of my camp with 12 cents and a broken boot, and the specific dignity of someone who knows they're asking for something hard and asks anyway. And I opened the door. Not because I thought it would change anything about my life, not because I was looking for something. I opened it because it was right, and because I had the means, and because what she needed was exactly the thing I knew how to give: shelter and steadiness, and someone who would not flinch at the men who came to undo what I'd done. She chose to stay. That's the part I think about. She had places she could have gone after March, after the men from Reedsville stopped coming. She wasn't trapped here, but she stayed. And then when I finally said out loud what I'd been carrying since January, she said she'd been waiting for it, and that she'd known since the day I stood in the cold and told those men no. She saw something in that. I'm still figuring out what exactly she saw. But I know it was me. Not a chief, not a useful arrangement, not a man with a warm lodge. Me specifically. What I am and how I do things and what I won't bend on. And that, in 51 years of hard and good and grinding and sometimes beautiful, nobody had quite done before. The Morgan dollar is on a shelf in our lodge now. She put it there. She said it was ours and should be somewhere you could see it. I look at it sometimes. The eagle has gone flat on the back, worn to almost nothing. I like it better that way. Something you carry for 11 years should show it.